The prophet Malachi or Malachi is the last of the prophets of the Hebrew Bible. Malachi may or may not be his actual name, but simply a way of referring to a man who was God's messenger, or more accurately, my messenger, the meaning of the word Malachi. Malach is also an angel, can mean messenger, Malachi. Malachi's book is set in post-exilic times after the return of the Jews from Babylonia. The Second Temple had been rebuilt and sacrificial worship resumed, and Judah was a province of Persia at that time. I mention the book of Malachi because the end of the book, it only has 3 chapters, forms the Haftarah reading for this Shabbat before Pesach. And this Shabbat is known as Shabbat Hagadol, the Great Sabbath, the Great Shabbat. The name comes from the closing verses of Malachi, chapter 3, Hinei anochi sholeach lachem et Eliah hanavi lifnei bo yom Adonai hagadol v'hanora. Behold, I will send you Elijah the prophet before the coming of the great and terrible day of the Eternal One. Some think, others think, that Shabbat Hagadol is not called because of this verse, but is designated because it's the day on which the rabbis preach their longest sermons of the year, instructing their congregants in all the detailed laws of Pesach. I was just thinking earlier that the Maharal of Prague, who lived in the 16th century, his sermon for Shabbat Hagadol is a sort of short novel, really, but please fear not. I think there's always a fear in the congregation, probably why not many people are here today. So it's the intrepid few that come out on Shabbat Hagadol. So what is the connection between Pesach, the festival we're about to celebrate, and these verses at the end of Malachi? Any suggestions? No? You're just too shy, because you do all know. It's the prophet Elijah who's mentioned in those closing verses of Malachi. Now, Elijah belongs to a class of prophets whom we might describe as charismatics. Unlike the literary prophets, Isaiah, Jeremiah, Amos, Hosea, and so on, Elijah and his successor Elisha have no books to their names. Elijah comes across as quite a heavy, brooding presence who suddenly appears. He literally sort of pops up in the first book of Kings with a terrible prophecy of drought. And if you know the Mendelssohn's oratorio, Elijah, that's how it begins. And it's quite haunting and quite frightening in many ways. What then follows, and this is what makes Elijah and Elisha different from our literary prophets, are a number of miracle stories. First, he's fed by ravens. Then he miraculously provides food for an impoverished widow and brings her dead son back to life. Pursued by King Ahab's infamous wife, Jezebel, I think, who ends her life being defenestrated, who has had 150 prophets of God assassinated, Elijah is labeled by her husband, Ahab, as a troubler of Israel, the troubler of Israel. And his story comes to a climax in 1 Kings chapter 18 in a contest between the God of Israel, championed by Elijah, and the idolatrous prophets of Baal, the result of which is at long last rain and, sadly, the slaughter of all those false seers who are hopping from one foot to another, trying to make rain happen by praying to their idols. Now, the Bible tells us that Elijah was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind, And the rabbis played on this, creating imaginative and folklorist legends about his miraculous reappearance at particular times, such as at a Brit Milah, a circumcision, where a chair is set aside for him. Of course, at the Pesach Seder, when a cup of wine is filled for him and the door opened to see if he's arrived. And the rabbis also saw him as an arbiter, one who in the Messianic age would resolve any legal problems that had not been decided upon by the rabbis. In all the folklore and myths surrounding the stories about the end of time, it is Elijah who will herald the coming of the Messiah or the Messianic age. So to return to the prophet of our Haftarah, Malachi, I'm struck by the fact that the book starts with a pronouncement about God's love for Israel and rejection of Esau. Ahavti etchem amar Adonai. I have shown you love, says the Eternal One. But you ask, how have you shown us love? After all, declares the Eternal One, Esau is Jacob's brother, yet I have accepted Jacob and have rejected Esau. This is not one of the most edifying verses of the Hebrew Bible. God is portrayed as a parent who prefers one child over the other. Jacob here representing the Israelites, Esau the Edomites, and other nations. So Malachi is obviously not referring to Jacob and Esau in the past because we don't have any mention of God preferring one over the other. It's kind of implicit, but to Jacob, Israel, in the time in which Malachi lives. So God who chooses favorites is theologically problematic. But at the same time, in the book of Malachi, this father figure is also represented as a master whose servants, Israel, have scorned his name, who offer blemished sacrifices on the altar of the sanctuary, who are careless in their observance of cultic rituals. So this same God can love his offspring while chastising them for negligence towards him. And even more remarkable in the complexity of this book, the same being, God, proclaims himself to be the parent of all humanity in the very famous verse, Halo av echad lechulanu, halo el echad bara'anu. Have we not all one parent? Did not one God create us? Moshe Halbertal, in his essay on the God of the Rabbis, makes this precise point about the diversity of God's roles contained within God's oneness. I quote here, what gives the anthropomorphic paradigm its monotheistic mark is the fact that while the polytheistic religions can distribute these diverse roles to different gods that inhabit their pantheon, in the case of the one God, all such roles and positions are located within one subject. God can be a parent who favors one people over another, a chastiser of his beloved people, executing punishment, and a God of all peoples, a God who, in contemporary terms, even if Malachi didn't see it in this way, affirms the oneness of humanity, the siblinghood of all peoples. Have we not all one Father? Did not one God create us? So the book ends with this array of contradictory roles inhabited by God. God as a relentless accuser against sinners, God who welcomes those who turn back to him, an indignant God who feels defrauded by Israel's failure to bring their offerings into the sanctuary, and a tender God to those who serve him. Into these contradictory theological expressions of God's nature bursts the image of the prophet Elijah, whose role here is not to proclaim the coming of a Messiah or the end of days, but to reconcile parents with children and children with their parents. In reading this Haftarah on the Shabbat before Pesach, the Ikar, the essential principle and message of Pesach, is underlined. Yes, we will tell the story of slavery, the plagues, and the exodus from Egypt, but Pesach is really about how we are with each other in a world that is turbulent and troubling. Like the book of Malachi, the festival of Pesach brings us face to face with a polarized world of good and evil, love and hatred, preference and prejudice that's projected onto Jacob and Esau, Israel and Egypt. But more importantly, Pesach offers a moral program of truth and reconciliation. Pesach confronts us with all the questions raised in the execution of such a program. What is the nature of our responsibility to others? How can we care for others? How can we maintain our own dignity and humility and accord to others our respect? How can we alleviate suffering and share the privileges and rights and freedom that we have in our own lives? As we sit down to celebrate Pesach tomorrow night, to engage in the prayers, stories, rituals, and songs of the Seder, may they generate and spur us to reflect and respond to each of those questions and meet the difficult demands of morality, justice, freedom, and holiness. Amen.